I'm with Harvey Hix, who is visiting Houston from Laramie, Wyoming. Thank you so much for coming here. It was a pleasure having you here for the event, and you were in Brazos yesterday. It was wonderful to have you.
Yeah, it's been a fabulous, crazy, fun visit.
Thank you. What do you think about food?
Okay. Food is lovely. I'm just zipping him up in the suitcase.
In the suitcase, taking him to Laramie. Right. So, what stands out to you about this visit to Houston in terms of the ports that you met, the intellectual community? What did you find different or interesting?
Well, it's exciting to see that there is an intellectual community. To see what you have created, what exists here. That, as per a previous conversation that we had last night or the night before, that it's not simply one school or one group of people, that it's people gathered for various reasons. Some of the people in the group were part of a critique group. Some are engaged in a shared project, a public poetry project. And so various groups, but coming together to form a larger group, to create a kind of larger dialogue. And so it's exciting to see that this exists in this place.
Right. Do you feel a different kind of energy, poetic energy, than you might see in a very different kind of state like Wyoming? And do you see something holding these different energies together in Houston in your short time here? Do you perceive something?
Right. It definitely feels different from Laramie, where in Wyoming it's simply there's a density of population issue.
Right.
There just aren't enough people in Wyoming, and people are so spread out that there's not there aren't the numbers to form that kind of community, and not the numbers of people close enough together. So I think it's only in larger urban centers like Houston where it's really possible to have a poetry community of a meaningful size.
Right. With the demographic diversity and the urban energies and the urban stresses, it leads to a different kind of poetry and art too, as you saw. Like we have on our walls Rashid Huck's photographs, and he's documenting Houston's industrial, I'm not sure how to call it, wasteland or landscape, so you found the photographs interesting?
Right, absolutely, yes, because I think those things are connected. One of the reasons for the greater diversity in Houston is a different history from the history in Wyoming, and so the cultural diversity has in part to do with the industrial history, and who has found employment here when, how long have people been here, how long have there been universities established, are there private universities, public universities, all of those kinds of questions all bear on who is present here. And so, Wyoming in general, Laramie in particular, does not have the degree of cultural diversity and ethnic diversity that Houston has, and therefore the community doesn't have as much.
Right. Well, one thing we didn't get to discuss, which I was hoping we would have, is the connection or the connections between the photography you see on the walls here and your poetry. And before you came from Wyoming, we were kind of thinking, yeah, they make sense, but now that you've been here for a couple of days, would you like to say something about how you see your work sort of connecting with his view of the,
Yes. Yeah, and we should say the name.
Rashid Huck.
Last name spelled H-A-Q.
H-A-Q.
Right, H-A-Q.
Right.
And yes, one of the things that strikes me as maybe this is an obvious thing to say, but it strikes me as very interesting about these photographs is the way in which one is drawn in by the formal qualities of them. So part of what to me is amazing about some of these photos is the recognition of color in subjects that we normally think of as dull. So we think of older industrial artifacts that the color has been dull, and yet those are Right. Color. And so it's the formal aspects that are the invitation of the photograph, but the subject matter then is a subject matter that reifies a history, and so it's a perceptual invitation into a public, civic subject matter, a question about who we are as humans. So we're invited into it by something perceptual, sensual, the color and shape and form. But then the question that is posed to us is a public, civic question, an ethical question. So the juxtaposition of those two is very much, I don't know if I'm achieving the poems, but it's something that I would like to achieve in the poetry.
Right. You wrote a book about color. We could say that, right? Because that's chromatic, right?
Right.
Yes.
Right.
Picking up from perhaps Wallace Stevens' ideas on color and abstraction,
Right.
How would you describe that book?
Right. Ways in which color stands in for us for other things and embodies our connection with the natural world.
Yeah.
That book was my midlife crisis book.
Yeah.
And so it's very much about questions of love and mortality. But the color in all of its senses, color as visual color, as musical color. So in all of those senses, for me, became a way to encode this swirl of emotions and forms of understanding that I was experiencing at the time.
When I think about, and this may sound odd to say, Wyoming and also Texas, a sort of strange kind of decadence, perversion, and specifically in the sexual or erotic sense, I do think of these states as this sort of wild, that's a kind of understanding and perception I have. And I was looking at some of your early poetry, the book from 2002, where that's very prominent. What happened to that strain of thinking in your poetry? Did you resolve it? Did it go away? What happened to it? I don't see it in the later stuff.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I think that it has changed some. I have changed some.
Yeah.
Some in no doubt very standard, typical ways. I'm older now than I was, and so maybe in simply not even just typical ways, but stereotypical ways.
Right.
But also the combinations. What obsessions are getting connected with what other obsessions? I think for me is sort of always changing, and so then what gets foregrounded becomes different with each book, which obsession, but they're all linked together. My spiritual / religious obsessions get foregrounded in Legible Heavens, but it's about sex too.
Right.
And my sexual obsessions get foregrounded in Perfect Hell, but it's about God too. And my political obsessions get formulated in other ways. And so which things getting foregrounded may vary, but they're all of them linked together.
Right. Well, I want to read your very earliest poetry books, which I don't believe I have, but the stuff that I have read, and we have been talking during your visit about your philosophy background as a PhD in philosophy, as a teacher of philosophy, and you also teach philosophy still along with poetry. So I would have expected the early poetry books transitioning from philosophy to poetry to have been different in texture than what I found in the 2002 book, for example.
Right.
Was there a phase where you were doing more philosophical, abstract stuff in the early poetry, or?
the first book has a sequence of poems, the titles of which are simply direct quotations from philosophers.
Right.
So sort of pulling out some little short snippet and adopting that as the title.
Yeah.
Sometimes a question to be answered or whatever. And so a very direct and visible link to the philosophical concerns and background.
Right.
But I think mostly for me it's been a not quite so explicit relationship between poetry and philosophy as it has been a sense that they share a feature which is an attempt to intensify language and to make it more exact. And so, insofar as we live in a kind of field of language, we inhabit language and are inhabited by language, that project of sharpening language, heightening language, intensifying language seems to me to be a crucial one in which much for us is at stake as humans. And so even though poetry and philosophy typically go about those in different ways, both of them are very concerned to intensify, sharpen, heighten language, make it more acute and more revealing. And so I'm interested in that. That's my ambition, whether I'm undertaking it through poetry as a vehicle for philosophy.
Right. Were you frustrated with philosophy in certain ways, where you felt that I can't explore certain things in philosophy, so I think I need to go to poetry to do that? Did that happen to you?
Absolutely.
Especially with academic philosophy, and maybe we think of poetic philosophers perhaps with Nietzsche and Wittgenstein and so on, but not the majority of them are not poetic philosophers, right?
Right. Absolutely.
Yeah. And were you able to work out those frustrations, if you will, in the poetry, or work out those ideas, or maybe establish a parallel system of thought in poetry?
I hope that my attempts to investigate both through poetry and philosophy, I hope that they remain in dialogue with one another. Neither project seems finished or finishable.
Yeah.
I'll be doing this
Until the end.
forever.
Sure.
But I hope that they're in contact with one another, and that each is trying to compensate for the other, to do some of what the other can't do, and so that each is somehow enriching the other, and that they're not simply separate projects or simply in contradiction.
Have you written recent philosophy papers or scholarly work that you think is parallel to your current poetry or recent poetry?
I'm trying to finish now a project that it's a philosophy project that it's taken 2 or 3 forms now. Never quite being fully realized, but it's trying to ask questions about the relationship between economy and ecology. And so I'm interested in such figures as the people who were the focus of the first version of this book are the essays of Wendell Berry, not so much his fiction or poetry, but his essays, and the systems theorist Danilo Meadows, the economist Amartya Sen, and the activist Vandana Shiva. And what I'm interested in about those 4 together as a kind of collective is that each proposes some alternative way of thinking about the economy, and in particular thinking about it in relationship to the sort of larger picture of humans in the cosmos. And so each proposes some form of alternative to the kind of neoliberalist global capitalism, to which I think very few people are proposing an alternative. It has almost become a kind of given, a thing that can't be questioned, and they're trying to question it. So I'm very interested in that, and I'm trying myself to pose a question to neoliberalism
Right.
to find out whether I can articulate for my